Item 2C, Draft 2020 Austin Climate Equity Plan. This is listed for discussion and possible action. Are Zach Baumer and/or Celine Rendon from the Office of Sustainability here?
Yep, this is Zach Baumer. I'm on the phone, as well as Celine Rendon, who's with me from my team, and Mark Couder.
Okay, well, if someone wants to share screen and walk us through, the floor is yours.
Okay, so someone else is going to share their screen, and we're just on the phone, so I'm just going to say next slide. We've got the same slide deck pulled up, and we'll just have to...
You got it.
Follow along. Okay, so I'm Zach Baumer. My title is Climate Program Manager. I'm with the Office of Sustainability, and we have been working for almost a year now on revising the Austin Community Climate Plan. I came and spoke to the Urban Transportation Commission, I don't know, over a year ago, and Kelly Davis, who is on your commission, is a representative on the Joint Sustainability Committee, which oversees the implementation of the climate plan. So for the summary slide, we have been updating the climate plan, like I said, for almost a year now. The full draft of this new revised climate plan is now out for public comment. It's available on Speak Up Austin. There's a short version and a long version of the plan. And the public comment period will last until the end of September, and then we're aiming to bring this to City Council for adoption either at the end of October or in early November. So today we're just looking for your comments, questions, areas of interest. The Joint Sustainability Committee passed a recommendation of support for this plan. So we're just going to sort of walk you through the process of what we've done and why we've done it and what we focused on in the creation of this plan. And then we'll hit on the recommended goals and strategies and then wrap up. And we'll try to go pretty quick because this is one of these presentations where like take an hour, but we're going to try to do this in like 15 minutes. So, okay. So next slide is 2015 Community Climate Plan. The original Austin Community Climate Plan was created in 2014 and 15. City Council in 2014 adopted the target of net zero community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Then we worked with stakeholders in the 2014-15 timeframe to create this plan, which was adopted by City Council in June of 2015. There were really three major sections of this plan: electricity and natural gas, transportation and land use, and then materials and waste management. It's important to note that, this was a very long effort. It was our first attempt at doing something this big and broad. It had a lot of qualitative kind of actions that were really mostly kind of pointed at city departments. And so we really strive to make it more quantitative this time around, make it much more community focused this time around, and really improve on this. So when this was adopted by council, it basically said that every 5 years this should be updated. So fast forward to summer of 2019, and it was time to start planning for the revision of this plan. So next slide, how was the plan created? So last summer, we took direction from the Joint Sustainability Committee. There was a working group of that committee that helped guide us in scoping out what should be in the revision of this plan. So what we ended up forming was about 24 city staff across the city organization, over 120 community members that we recruited, and we essentially joined those groups together, created a steering committee, as well as 5 advisory groups that began working about last November to create the new goals and strategies that would become this new Austin Climate Equity Plan. So each one of these groups, the steering committee, all these advisory groups met every other week for 2 hours. They've all met, like 15 plus times now. So there's been thousands of hours of community donated time to create this effort. And the real key thing to note here is that this has been a collaborative process, that we've worked hand in hand with community members serving on these advisory committees to create this planning effort. And we haven't used consultants. This has been like a sort of co-creation process with the community. Next slide, steering committee. So our steering committee is a diverse set of individuals that are community members that volunteered their time to kind of be my board of directors for this plan creation process. So I just highlight their names because all these people have put in a ton of effort, donated, lots and lots of their time to really guide our decision-making process and deciding what we include and what we don't include and make big decisions about the planning effort. So it's just really important to highlight these folks. Next slide. A history of inequity. So when we started this planning process, the Joint Sustainability Committee made it clear to us that we needed to center equity at the heart of this plan revision. So we began working with the Equity Office, having lots of conversations about what does that mean and really trying to understand where do we start. So we started with lots of data and history from our city. And, pre-1928, 1928 master plan, creating segregation in our city, leading to environmental injustices that have happened over the last century. Now, dramatic gentrification occurring on the east side, massive economic inequities in our community, and health inequities that are now being, really displayed during this time of COVID-19. So the bottom line here is that what we really came to understand is that, these inequities started a long time ago, but they are very much present today. And, as city staff working on an issue, these things can't be ignored and they need to be at the center and in front of our mind when we're thinking about a planning process. So next slide. While at the same time, this is a climate plan, so we're here to address climate change. So humans have been burning oil, gas, and coal for 150 years, emitting billions and billions of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, changing the Earth's climate. The Earth's climate is already warmed by 1 degree. Global emissions have not started to come down. So there's urgency more than ever to reduce emissions and reduce emissions dramatically quickly. Next slide. So another tie-in with equity that's been that really became more and more clear is that when we think about how the climate is going to change, it is going to mean more extreme heat, more drought, more risk of wildfire, and more intense rain and flooding events. So, these things this is part of the climate of Austin as we know it, but these things are going to become more intense and happen more frequently. So then when you start to think about who is affected by those things and how are they affected, it becomes really clear that low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately affected by these hazards and will even be affected more as the climate changes into the future. So it's kind of impossible to not think about equity issues when you start thinking about climate. So next slide. So our commitment to climate equity. So how this kind of all comes together is that, we were doing research and we had this new set of diverse stakeholders and we're starting to think about how does climate and equity come together. And we, all plan participants went through a one-day climate equity workshop that we hired an outside facilitator, a guy, local community member named Dr. Tane Ward. He organized us and we went through a full day of conversations about this. And where we ended up is that, for having a plan that focuses on eliminating the use of fossil fuels and then also trying to strive to eliminate disparities that can be predicted by race in our community, where we end up, the intersection of those two issues is these values in the center. So if we center the plan for all residents in Austin and starting with low-income communities and communities of color, prioritizing their health, affordability, accessibility, cultural preservation, community capacity, just transition, and accountability. If we really zero on improving those things, then we will end up getting to addressing climate inequity through those solutions. So the bottom line with this, and the bottom line for me, is that, the really understanding that I came to, as a white man in my sort of position of privilege at the city is that, by me really understanding that if we're not proactively addressing equity and addressing these inequities in our community, we're just perpetuating injustice. Injustice exists, business as usual exists, which creates injustice, and we have to really be thinking about this at every step of the way. Next slide. Okay, so emissions. So when we think community-wide emissions, we're talking about all of the emissions from all activities in our community. So this is all the energy use in all the homes and businesses, all the transportation energy to move everyone around our entire community. So the total emissions for all community activities were, in our baseline, over 14 million tons per year. Now they're down to about 13 million tons per year. And as you can see, as we project out into the future, Austin Energy's plans of decarbonizing the electricity grid, retiring fossil power plants, adding renewables, the carbon footprint associated with electricity is going to be dropping dramatically. So very soon, the largest sector of emissions is transportation. And so that is using the gasoline and diesel to move everything around this community. So looking out into the future, the initial goal that was adopted by City Council was net zero emissions by 2050. It's been recommended by the steering committee and as part of this plan now that goal be moved sooner and more aggressively. So now you can see the proposed goal line here, the darker line. So now the goal proposal is net zero emissions by 2040 with a steep decline and then trying to get to negative emissions beyond 2040. So this is not adopted by council yet. This is just what is being proposed by the committee. So next slide. So once we then, knew what we were going to focus on, we had this center of equity. We really had to determine what were we going to include in this plan revision, because there are many, as you see on the right, there are many different city departments already designing, implementing, passing, creating efforts that reduce emissions. So key to this group is that, the strategic mobility plan was adopted last year. Cat Metro and Project Connect is fully underway. So we had to figure out how are we going to create a plan that fits within these other plans, doesn't overstep, doesn't overrule different departments. So we had to figure out at all times, how do we fit this plan into these other efforts? So what we focused on this time around, and these are the 5 advisory groups that we created that were these co-creation places of city staff and community members. So sustainable buildings, electrifying transportation and land use, which we're going to talk about in more specifics, natural systems, which is all of the trees and agriculture and natural systems around us, and then consumption of goods and food. So next slide, equity process. Celine, our community engagement specialist, is going to talk a little bit about this slide and the next slide.
Hi, everyone. My name is Celine Rendon. This was the equity process that was adopted for all advisory groups. It is adapted from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity Racial Equity Toolkit, which is what the Equity Office uses for their equity assessment tool. So we adopted this 7-step process for our advisory groups. Like Zach mentioned, we did have a required workshop for all participants to understand the history and major inequities here in Austin, and to also look at demographic data that was available from the city. And this helped them just identify important climate and equity goals within the goals and strategies of the advisory group. If you go, no, we don't. So for step 5 and 5B, that's where the equity tool came in, and I can follow up further information of that equity tool, but it highlights the major themes that Zach brought up earlier around health, affordability, cultural preservation, and so on. And that was a screening tool process where it had a series of questions under each theme, and that was co-created with community members that served on our steering committee. And to understand the impact of it, is it a benefit? Is it a benefit? Is it harm? Or is it no impact? But I think it's just a helpful tool to kind of get our advisory groups going to think about an equitable process and to think about historic harm that has happened from city planning processes that have not had equity baked into the whole process. You can go to the next slide. And here is our Community Climate Ambassador Program. It's one of our major community engagement components of the climate plan. We selected 12 individuals to serve as community climate ambassadors, and they were compensated to facilitate their own community conversations. And they had the freedom to kind of choose what topics they wanted to facilitate within their community groups. A lot of folks focused on cultural connection, other folks focused on people with disabilities, language access, and so on. And we just had a panel last week that was recorded, and it's available on our Facebook of a Facebook Live recording. But we had 6 ambassadors get to talk about their experience and their major takeaways. But overall, the interview reports that we have collected is really incorporating now for our engagement process, and just also redefining kind of what community engagement means. We just learned a lot from our ambassadors around different topic areas such as like reproductive justice, disability justice. And so I'm really excited to have that kind of create a framework for our outreach and engagement for our office, but also to help and encourage other departments and city offices to kind of take that lead as well, to understand these different issues around intersectionality and how we have to bridge those connections around climate issues.
Thanks, Wayne. Okay, so we obviously spent a lot of time on the process. So now to the draft goals and strategies. So if you go to the slide that says summary at the top, slide 15. So what you're going to see in the next few slides and in the full documents that are available online is 18 quantitative goals that we've created that are what needs to be accomplished by 2030 to keep us on track, and then 75 strategies that fit underneath those goals. And these strategies are things that need to be implemented in the next 5 years to make progress. So we're really trying to focus here on the short term. You'll see that we really, due to the equity tool, we ended up centering equity sort of throughout these strategy proposals. So lots of prioritization, recommendations on prioritization of incentives and targeted communications at low-income communities and communities of color, trying to get to things that address anti-displacement, really trying to build on this concept of a just transition, training, jobs, entrepreneurship for new low-carbon solutions, health benefits, and then ongoing learning and studies, but really focused on communities of color. Okay, so the first area here is cross-cutting strategies. So I'm gonna, as we go through these strategies, there's a lot in this which, you know, is much better digested when you sort of look at the whole thing. So I'm gonna kind of go quickly. So the cross-cutting strategies are green jobs and entrepreneurship kind of across all areas, regional collaboration across all areas because the city can't do this by themselves, and then thinking about how carbon offsets and eventually, you know, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere fits across this entire planning effort.
I think we should be on the next slide. Yeah.
And then, so now I'm on sustainable buildings.
You got it.
So in the sustainable buildings area, there are 4 goals that are being proposed. So the 4 goals are, the first one is around decarbonizing buildings and getting to net zero carbon buildings for all new buildings, and then eventually existing buildings, a percentage by 2030, and then all eventually by 2040. The second one is around reducing emissions from refrigerant leakage. This is kind of a hidden unknown issue of the chemicals that are in air conditioners and refrigerators and freezers. When those chemicals leak to the atmosphere, they cause climate change as well as deplete the ozone layers, so addressing those. The next one is around reducing the embodied carbon footprint of building materials. The choices that we make with steel and concrete and wood, and the balance of those building materials with all the construction in our community have a huge impact on climate change. And then the last one is around water, reducing water demand and trying to reduce that energy-water nexus. The next section is transportation and land use. So as I said earlier, transportation is very soon to become the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our community. So there are 2 sectors focused on transportation. The first one, which is the most important one, is how do we get people around the city without the use of cars? So on the phone is Mark Couder, who led up this advisory group. So I'm going to let him walk you through some of these details.
Thank you, Zach. So yeah, I'm Mark Couder, and I helped to lead up the advisory group. I'm assuming you're on the slide that says transportation and land use, that has a picture of a Cab Metro bus and a bunch of logos. We worked with a lot of different community members, including Cab Metro, Campo, Movability Austin, Poder, Travis County, Community Powered Workshop. But we also worked with about a dozen other groups as well, like the Austin Climate Coalition, Austin History Center, Nelson Nygaard, Texas Democrats with Disabilities, Sunrise Movement, et cetera. And over the period of 6 months to a year, we really had meetings every 2 weeks, sometimes weekly meetings. We had workshops, and we had a lot of discussions. We came up with 4 overall goals with strategies underneath those. So let's jump in. Next slide. So transportation land use.
Mark,
yeah.
Real quick, I said they have a slightly different version of yours, this presentation. So they're just looking at one slide that has all 4 of the goals on it.
Okay, so I'll just run through them.
Yeah.
Okay. So goal number 1 is that by 2030, 80% of new non-residential development is located within the city's growth center and corridors. And here it's really focused on basically 2 ways of looking at it. One is, where are large employers going to be located, and how do we leverage that investment with local amenities such as affordable housing, healthy food access, health centers, libraries, et cetera. And how do we sort of work with those organizations to put in transportation networks and employment locations for those people, but also creating mobility hubs and then managing parking. And parking is both for employers who are looking at cash out programs, but also how do we provide free parking for amenities that are needed by the community, such as health centers, et cetera. Now,
I think you go back one slide. Thank you.
So the benefits of this is that it is inclusive, it provides healthy outcomes for people who really need it, and then it reduces air pollution from cars. The next goal is focused on housing. This is really based on the Austin Housing Blueprint and community members, and it's by 2030, 70% of new housing units are located within the city's growth centers. And this is also, for the last goal, connected to how do we make sure that affordable housing is near and has access to amenities such as health centers, daycare, grocery stores, et cetera, and ensuring that we do provide deeply affordable units for those people who need them. This is through looking at funding affordability, making sure that people who are almost about to lose their affordability can stay in place, enhancing community engagement so that people have a voice in those decision-making processes. The third goal is around public transportation, so public transit, so that by 2030, 5% of all distance traveled by public transit is by public transit. And this is through expanding and improving public transit now, looking to promote free transportation where we can, specifically for communities with the least amount of resources, and then looking at transit stops themselves to make sure that people can access them easily, that they're easy to find, and that they have a fair amount of community engagement when we think about how those things are set up. We want to reduce housing transportation costs and burden onto the community as much as possible so that these community members can have access to those, what would they need for daily needs. And then the last goal is focused on what we call people-powered transportation. These are bicycles, walking, people in wheelchairs, but also family members with strollers. And how can we really make that a viable option in Austin so that by 2030, 4% of all distance travel would be some kind of people-powered mode. This is by prioritizing bicycle networks within our system, by enhancing education, providing these services, and providing sort of engagement processes so that communities can have bicycles as an option, and also improving the urban landscape, the trails, the sidewalks, the crosswalks, so that anybody either in a wheelchair or just walking can feel comfortable, safe, and not have barriers. We want to make sure that we provide inclusive, accessible places for people in Austin, and that transportation is a viable option when it's not in your car.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so the next slide is transportation electrification. And so as Mark said, we really prioritized, the trip that doesn't use a car or the trip that's on public transportation is the best solution here. But we also realize that there are still going to be hundreds of thousands of vehicles on the road because of the way that our city has been designed and laid out and where people live. So the goals here are around electrifying the remaining transportation. So by 2030, aiming for 40% of total vehicle miles traveled in the city to be electrified. And then by 2030, having compelling and equitably distributed charging infrastructure across the city, so it's ubiquitous and cheap and simple to use to support all those vehicles. And then finally, really making this a regional effort for electrification, because many of the people that have the longest commutes and the most expensive commutes are the people who live in surrounding cities and counties. And how can the city of Austin, with our soon to be zero carbon electricity, support this transportation to improve air quality and reduce emissions? So next slide, food and product consumption. There are two final sections here I'm going to go through quickly. So for this section, we're aiming to look sort of upstream, so not at recycling and composting. We're looking at kind of the bigger picture. So the first goal is around trying to ensure that everyone is food secure in our community and that we do what we can to support pro-climate and pro-health foods that are better for people's bodies and better for the environment. The second one is around reducing the impact of institutional purchasing. So think purchasing, that goes on from UT and large corporations and the city of Austin and the state can have a massive upstream impact when we make better choices and more sustainable choices with purchasing. And then the last goal here is around supporting an upcoming target to be adopted by the revised Zero Waste Plan, and really trying to support their efforts to focus on circular economy and reuse and fixing things in the community. So then final slide is natural systems. This is a brand new section that people are really excited about. So this is addressing how do we protect the carbon that is stored out there in all of our trees and all of our soils, and then how do we enhance the carbon sequestration ability of those natural systems? So aiming to protect an additional amount of natural lands, aiming to protect lots more farmland in our 5-county area and really support regenerative agriculture on that land. The third goal is around dramatically increasing the amount of tree canopy covering we have in our city and really specifically focusing on areas that are very low now. And then finally, trying to have all city-owned lands under management plans that result in neutral or negative carbon emissions on their lands. Because if you manage land the wrong way, you can actually be like releasing the carbon. So last slide here is schedule. The draft plan is fully out for review and public comment right now. We are, in addition to this commission, we're presenting to like 20 other commissions. So we're going to go through all that process in September and then address comments and finalize this planning effort in October and then present to council by the end of October or early November. So so I'll just end it there, and we can answer any questions that you all have. And if we sort of left it out of this presentation, but there has been a lot of quantitative analysis that's been done on modeling emissions, and we have like a dashboard where you can model different activities and reduction scenarios. So if anybody is interested in like nerding out on that as it relates to transportation, I'd be glad to follow afterwards. So thank you.
Okay, thank you all for the presentation. Do I see anybody want to raise a hand? Commissioner Summers.
So I'm curious a little more about some of the details around metro region cooperation and how you're going to facilitate that. This commission heard from, the Campo planning process, 2045, I think, 5-year period, right? But planning process, and a lot of ways, those master regional plans sometimes are really enacting sprawl in a lot of ways and constructing new roads and building out and out and out. And no matter what we do within the city of Austin, as far as like getting our concentrating things in centers and doing better transit and more bikes and less free parking and less parking overall, the types of things we do, if we're not partnering and getting some reforms at sort of the MSA level with Campo and their planning, as well as with our, partner municipalities in our region, those people are still going to be getting it. And especially if we're not building a lot of housing and jobs in the city, those people are still going to be getting on the roads and releasing a ton of carbon as they come into the city to work and play and live and do things. So I'm curious, I know you spoke to a little bit, but like, what are the concrete partnerships and things that you have in this plan to work on that issue? Because we all say we're going to cooperate. Well, we cooperate to create the Campo plan, and that's taking us in largely the wrong direction, I think. So like, what can we do? What can we do?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a really hard question. We absolutely not acknowledge all those things that you said. And, in my time at the city, like I have spent, good amount of time trying to collaborate with Campo and not been super successful. We had, I think, a couple of members of Campo who participated in this process, but it was kind of, marginal. The other avenue that I've pursued over the years is through CAPCOG and their sort of regional coordination around air quality. I think the idea is that we would, start probably with the CAPCOG relationships with the surrounding, elected officials and staff members from surrounding cities and counties. But I think just getting people in the room and getting people to talk about it is only going to get us so far. So, some of the ideas, my personal ideas that we're going to have to do is try to come up with, a shared motivation and like some carrots to try to get people actually working together and on the same page about this. And I don't claim to have the answers, and I don't claim to have a super concrete plan right now. But I think it starts with staff and connecting at the staff level, and then also like making sure that the elected officials, from our city that support this plan really will help us like put in that work to actually try to build more coalition and support around this. And then, I know that there's a long history of complication around the land use issues. And I think trying to also now balance in kind of this question of electrifying transportation, figure out how that fits into this as well. So I know that's not a super good answer. And I look forward to, anyone who's interested in trying to support us as we try to move forward beyond adoption of this plan.
I want to segue a little bit to a specific question that I had, which is sort of the, okay, so on one of the slides, he talks about a plan of plans, and it really hits the same idea, is that I am unclear, and maybe there is an answer, maybe there isn't an answer, how this plan fits into, regional governments, how it fits into other city plans, how it fits into the people who make the toll roads, the people who make, PUDs out beyond Eastland Park and et cetera. So you had that slide, it says plan of plans, it's got a little hexagon graphic or whatever, and then it has another set of bullet points. What is the legal mechanism of this plan having any influence on kind of anybody, even city staff? How does this have legal influence on park staff and ATD staff and police staff and, land use and code compliance, et cetera?
Yeah, so I would, it's kind of a simple answer. Sadly, I'd say that this plan does not have legal mechanisms or binding like measures within it. It's kind of the visionary like direction to get us towards this, long-term aspirational goal. And we don't hold a lot of the levers, but this is sort of the way that it's been like set up by, the way that council kind of directs us and asks for these kind of things, is that they look for what needs to be accomplished and how could we get there. And so that's what we deliver. And then it's up to, departments, it's up to city council, it's up to everyone to sort of like pick this up and own it beyond adoption.
Are they required to pick from the recipes in this book, so to speak, or can they go off book and do their own thing? If they're going to build a fleet, do they have to look at these and say, oh, according to these requirements, 40% of our new fleet needs to be electric, or et cetera?
Yeah, so those kind of things are built into this plan, but again, like it will take us holding ourselves accountable. It will take city council saying, look, we passed this plan. Hey, fleet, it's in the plan that you're supposed to have a 100% electric fleet by 2030. Like, how are you doing that? So by adopting the plan and supporting the plan, it sets the goals and the framework, which are the right things that we need to be doing to address climate change. But it doesn't, like, the accountability is only as good as everyone referencing and coming back to this plan.
Okay. Anyone else have questions?
I think you kind of touched on my question with the last two answers, but just to kind of clarify, what do you see as your role moving forward after this plan is adopted? Do you have like a dedicated team that's kind of like keeping an eye on all the projects around town to say, hey, you remember we have the climate plan, or how are you going to implement this and moving forward like that?
Yeah. So that's there's a section on accountability and implementation and funding that's in the full version of the plan. And the idea is that after adoption, that last time around when this plan was adopted 5 years ago, it was adopted and then we kind of left it up to departments to like find their own funding and implement things. And that only went so far. And so, this time around, what we are planning to do is create sort of like a new round of engagement after this is adopted and create implementation teams that are focused on developing like the specific tasks and schedule and budget to get many of these things done, and then have those plans available, created with departments, but also available for council, and then, to try to drive a much more specific implementation plan this time around. That's more transparent and like more complete than just like, okay, we'll wait to hear like how things are going next year. So there's definitely much more work to do. So if you didn't participate in this plan this time around, but are interested in coming back and helping on implementation, we will take your support.
Well, I'm sure you thought about this, but I just offer the idea that you've done such a good job of bringing in community members and all these advisory groups. Hopefully people on the ground can be advocates for the plan and keeping everybody's feet to the fire moving forward. I think that's probably in the part of the idea there with all these grassroots kind of advisory councils. So hopefully they'll be able to maintain their coordination.
Yep.
Zach, I have a question. Are you still planning to take this draft to council in October?
Yeah, the plan now is there's a council date on October 29th, and then there's one on November 12th. I think it's probably more likely that we'll be there on November 12th. So.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering about the timing because I know that comments are being accepted till September 30th. And,
yeah.
I think there needs to be some time in between that.
Yep, absolutely.
So
for you guys to digest those comments. And I know that you're presenting at 20 commissions or something, and that the Joint Sustainability Committee actually adopted a recommendation supporting in support of this draft, hoping that other commissions like ours would do the same.
Well, this is posted for possible action. So when we get to it, if you have something to propose, I think people will.
Well, I don't right now. Actually, it didn't like occur to me until.
Well, we can always do the motion. I mean, we can do the motions of support. I don't know that we need to make a full recommendation. We've done that in the past, unless I'm misremembering that. But before we get into that, the action portion, I do have a couple of like kind of specific questions. You know, if you're looking for feedback. So as a person who loves data, as I sort of read through this, some things jump out at me. There's a slide about electrification that says this translates to 460,000 electrical vehicles on the road. And I would be curious to know how realistic is that number? And by that, I mean, what's the number of electric vehicles sold in this country? You know, what's the rate of that growth? Because that seems like a big percentage of electrical vehicles being in Austin. And is that number magical? Does it really depend on that number? And if not, or either support the number in some meaningful way or take it out would be my advice, because it jumped out at me as a weird number. So if you have some background for that, I wouldn't mind knowing.
Yeah. So right now there are, so the 460,000 is, the number is more, we were trying to, not like promote a number of vehicles. So the goal is, that just is the translation of 40% of VMT. And why that number is so high is because when you start modeling out, how do we get this steep reduction of emissions, out 10 years, out 20 years? And the only way to do it is to have like, really high percentages of people out of cars or electrify those cars. And so what we did is we built a model that had lots of different scenarios, these slider bars where you could move different percentages and different adoption curves. And where we are right now is about 10,000 vehicles on the road, like in this area, are electric, or battery electric. And so, yeah, it's a dramatic increase. And you would essentially have to get to, after 2020, like in the 2026, 27 area, you would have to be getting to almost every single new car sold being electrified. And that's aggressive, but, if you go out and we were to pull, 10 different electric vehicle adoption curves right now, you'd have some that would say it's going to be super low out to 2060, and then you'll have some that'll say that, every car is going to be electric by 2030. So it's kind of, it's a very hard thing to predict. But I think in terms of like, if we have the zero carbon electricity, that we need to strive for this to be as aggressive as we can. Because if we don't, like, we're not going to get anywhere near meeting these targets. So that's kind of, there was a lot of discussion about how do we get to this and how do you, what does this mean? But the bottom line is that it's aggressive, but potentially doable.
Okay, I want to follow up a little bit. So I'm all for dream a mighty dream, be bold, like push way too far or way further than you think you can get. Just, I guess, be prepared for, some questions and whether or not you want to distract people with that exact number. But then on a strategy side, I would say that the thing that jumps out at me about not great about that number is 500,000 vehicles is 500,000 vehicles. And the pollution from the rubber tires, the pollution from the way cars work is not great. So, electrical vehicles are better than no vehicles, but 500,000 vehicles is not great. So from a pure climate standpoint, to be really genuinely bold, it would be, how can we take 500,000 vehicles off the road? How can we get, a train system that works or a bus system that works or et cetera. So I would think about that. I'm not saying, rework your strategies, but I think that's a legitimate question you should be prepared to answer. Why are you adding 500,000 electric vehicles? Why not? Why is the goal not to take off 500,000 vehicles? Just throwing that out there. If you have a comment, if not, that's fine.
Yeah, sure. So right now there are about 600,000 vehicles, and the projection from TTI and others is that that gets up to 800,000 plus beyond 2030. And then when we do the math, we've worked very closely with Cap Metro on understanding exactly what their projections are. And if they fully build out Project Connect and we fully get it full of people every day, all the time, we maybe get to 5% of the total VMT reduced. So the challenge is that by 2030, the people still have to move around. And so it's going to be beyond 2030, we could, once we get a first round of full public transportation, supported build out, then you could build upon that to really escalate it beyond there. But for the time frame of 2030, it's just, there wasn't a planner or someone who thought that we would, reasonably be able to get much higher than that of actually avoided and eliminated trips.
Can I ask you a question?
If you want, this is a really interesting thing that we have this whole model for. And if we want to follow up after this meeting, we can show you that and show you all the details.
Just to follow up on that, I understand. I'm completely in favor of aggressive goals. This is a problem that's exceeding, but also creating I worry sometimes that we're creating plans that are not achievable in some realm and then missing opportunities elsewhere. And so one thing that, and there's a little bit of this in what you presented, and I haven't read the full report yet, I will. But one of the things that I would say that we can do that we haven't been great job doing is looking at the street real estate that we have now and immediately, proactively reallocating it to non-carbon modes. We can do that. We don't have to go out and convince people and beg people or try to scrounge up money for electric vehicle programs. We can just do it, and also I'm going to go back to Campo governance and Campo decision making. We have to look at it. Campo, which is, has city council people, we just committed to huge expansion of I-35. It's not aligned. We have cognitive dissonance in our planning here. And so anything that your staff can do to help make our progressive city council members grapple with that decision in an honest way and reduce that cognitive dissonance, I think is going to be helpful. But I think a lot of it also comes down to streets and how we are using our streets, because we can reallocate our streets in a way that we can decide it. We don't have to rely on hundreds of thousands of people being convinced. And I hope we will. I hope the next vehicle that I buy will be an electrical vehicle, for example. But that's a bet that we're taking. I want us to be aggressive in our goal setting, but let's look at our street real estate and how we allocate that. And that's it. Those are decisions that we can make sometimes more easily.
Yeah, and I'd like to second that and expand. And I see in goal number 4 of your natural systems strategy, you do talk about using city-owned lands to reclaim public space. Now, I think here you're talking about kind of medians and open space, but I would challenge you to think about, large right-of-way areas and spaces where that, like Commissioner Summers said, we could reclaim right-of-way. And we're actually going to be talking about this in our next item here with the healthy streets. So it's already on my mind, especially in terms of COVID. That was the point of the Healthy Streets program. And actually, and this kind of relays into my next question is, did you include any ideas or material about COVID or the ongoing pandemic or ongoing unemployment crisis in this plan? Is that kind of too late to tack on at the end there? Is that something you broached at all?
Yeah, it was included a little bit in terms of health benefits, and then in terms of like jobs and training and entrepreneurship. So I think the connection was there, but yeah, like it wasn't this like things focus. And I guess the last area was like trying to build upon this the momentum that we have now with being remote and working, eliminating trips by virtual meetings. So it was kind of connected in those areas.
Gotcha. And then one other quick question I had is, did you guys include any kind of stipulations on how to maybe plug into future legislation such as a Green New Deal or some sort of jobs program that might come down the road? God willing, that we have something to provide some relief for people and maybe create green jobs coming in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think we tried to stay away from kind of like the politicization like of stuff like that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think depending on what happens in November, like a lot of what's in this plan will get a boost and will be, could be, even more supported. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we're like relying on it.
Thanks.
Any other commissioners have items for discussion or potential action? Commissioner Davis is spinning.
Oh,
There you go.
oh,
There you go.
can you hear me though?
Yes.
Well, I think that everyone's brought up really great questions and points, and I'd like to incorporate those as suggestions.
Oh, she cut out for me.
Which would be after the close of the public comment period, but I guess at a commission, we're kind of special and we could do that anyway, as long as it's before the plan goes to council.
So you broke up for me in sort of the middle of your sentences, so I don't know if everybody else heard it. You want to say it again, Kelly?
Oh. I want to take the discussion here today and put it into a recommendation to vote on next month.
Okay, I'm good with that for sure. Do we want to make a motion of support or anything, or do we just want to sort of end this discussion and we'll just take it up again and get it on our agenda for next month? You good with picking it all up next month? I see some head nods. Okay. All right. Given that, is there any other discussion before we close this one out? And we'll make sure to
So that we're pretty sure that if we make our recommendation next month, that it'll be in time for council. Is that?
If they're on November 12th, then for sure, because we'll have October.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be in time.
Okay.
I wouldn't get them before then.
Okay. All right. Well, then, Kelly, we will look to you to wrangle something up, and you can send it out via email ahead of time if people want to weigh in. And with that, I think we are done. Thank you, Zach and Celine and others.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.
You too.